Guyana. Rod asked me to have a chat with you to show at the upcoming Guyana Speaks meeting. There are so many topics I'd love to chat about, but the 40th anniversary of the Jonestown tragedy is in November. Your book, A New Look at Jonestown from a Guyanese Perspective, is sadly out of print, but you did extensive research into the tragedy for it. What led you to wanting to write about Jonestown?
Ah, yes. As you say now, it is a good question. I had wanted, in fact, I was on the spot when Jonestown took place, when it developed. I was working at first active in AFSCRIA, the African Society for Cultural Relations with Independent Africa, and then in the Working People's Alliance, of which we had become a part. And you know, Jonestown was a lot of mystery to us resident in Guyana at the time. And what made me decide to write about it was after I had been living in San Diego with my family for about 2 years. I think it was in the year 2005. There was a film at San Diego State University, and I was invited by Khalil Mohammed and Rebecca Moore in the Department of Religion to come and see this film. Well, that is what made me decide that I had to write about Jonestown, because on a panel at the film were 5 survivors. And for the first time I was seeing Jonestown people and hearing them and hearing what they had to say about Jonestown and Jim Jones and so on. It was called, I think, The Life and Death of People's Temple. After the discussion was over, I asked them whether they would allow me to interview them, and they all agreed. And that is how this big book was conceived.
Of the 4 survivors you spoke to, who left the greatest impression and why?
Well, they were all impressive in their own way. One communicated very little because she was not very involved. I don't think she even went to Jonestown. But there were 2 of them that were outstanding. One was Laura Johnson Cole, who is very much on the internet these days and who wrote a book some years ago, before mine came out. And I found them to be very, very open, you know, from their own point of view. And the other person was an African American who was a follower, member of Jim Jones' outfit. His name is, but his interview was very, very impressive because he revealed things that he had not had a chance to see for many years. And he had become a speaker at college campuses and so on as a survivor. He was a survivor by chance, by accident, because he had been sent to California on a mission by Jim Jones, and before he could return, the thing imploded.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. I'll tell you his name in a minute. Huey. His name is Huey, and he became a kind of missionary too afterwards. Huey will do for now, I hope.
Did he have family there?
lost a son there.
Oh my goodness.
He lost his wife there. He just happened to be in the USA by accident, so it was a great trauma for him. Yes.
He must have been feeling guilt as well as everything else.
Yes. And I've seen him since, because they used to have an annual meeting in San Diego. Dr. Rebecca Moore, who was head of religion at SDSU, San Diego State University. They gathered every year and had a kind of day together. It's very interesting because these are very interesting people with some kind of sense about social change and so on, you know. And I came to the impression that they had really been betrayed by this man, Jim Jones, who had all the cards stacked in his hands and knew exactly what he was about and not about, you know. But his rhetoric was very populist and what they call here progressive, you know. And as Laura Johnson Cole said when I asked her, how could a person like you that I'm talking with now follow Jim Jones? She said, well, he was saying all the right things. You see, he came down on the right side of every issue, on the side of the people. He was, and in California, the organization they ran there, People's Temple, was a very effective organization, very, very effective. It had its mystique, it had its mystery, but it also had a track record of service to ordinary people. People like victims of the police and so on. And they would find rescue at People's Temple. They would find a home there. And in particular, it was an attempt to build a multi-racial organization, including both black and white people. And of course, the rhetoric said they would be equal and they would share an equal destiny in the People's Temple and in the society. And a lot of them meant that. Jim Jones himself meant it conditionally, provided his psyche was accommodated. And he had a peculiar, and I would say a deformed psyche, unfortunately.
So that leads me to another question. I mean, how is it that people would follow? I can understand, you know, being in admiration of someone who is saying all the right things and helping all the right people, but to follow them to a different continent, what was their motivation to just pick up sticks and?
Well, their motivation was simple enough. A lot of them were African Americans, and a lot of them came from segregated parts of the United States of America. And in the People's Temple, there was not that kind of segregation. The segregation in People's Temple was rather subtle, and it was a matter of class and education rather than race, you see. So they went to Guyana because Jim Jones promised them that he would build there a society in which there is no segregation, in which all are equal. And they were already living that kind of life in San Francisco, at the People's Temple headquarters. And as we talk, you will see where the subtleties came in. But it was the only place where they could be free and were not told where to sit and where to walk, and you know.
Except by him.
Except by him, but his strictures were very subtle, very subtle. They did not take an overt racial line at all. And I'm a person very, very, very curious about race and the relationship between races and dominance and that kind of thing. And it is hard to put your finger on Jim Jones and say that was his motive. His motive was discrimination. Although in that book I did try to bring out where he had these underlying apprehensions about the other, you know. And a lot of that information came from Pastor Huey. He called himself Father Huey, I think. He called himself a father because Jim Jones became a father. And what this book brought out, and a lot of people missed, there were a lot of very sharp journalists that descended on Jonestown and wrote about it. And there's one of them who wrote a book called Raven. If you have read that kind of literature, you would know Raven. To me, Raven is the best work on Jonestown. It was written by a journalist and some other people, two persons. But the thing about the People's Temple that is not brought out is that Jones tried to model the movement on the peace missions of Father Divine. Father Divine being an African American. And I don't know between him and Jim Jones who was the more clever. And, but he claimed divinity, which Jim Jones often did. Jim Jones claimed to be the reincarnation of every great figure you could think of. Yes. Whereas Father Divine was simply the divine himself.
Wow.
But in each case, they developed a movement with black and white on what appeared to be equal terms. One of them a white leader and the other a black leader.
Interesting.
Yes.
So he modeled himself up to a point after this Father Divine, you think?
To a point is correct, because he had a movement before meeting Father Divine, but he visited Father Divine at the peace missions, as they called it, and copied a number of mechanisms. See, for example, he then became Father because Divine was a father, and Father Divine's words were final within the movement. But Jim Jones had a tragic flaw in all he was doing. He went back to California. He was very, very impressed with the peace missions. You see, this Father Divine was not a mere mystic or someone talking religion or preaching about divinity. He ran a very active peace movement in this country, campaigning against the hydrogen bomb
Mm-hmm.
and collecting a lot of signatures and, and taking up social issues, lynching, desegregation, and so on. So he was that kind of person, and in that sense, there was a resemblance between the two of them.
Mm.
And I didn't think I had learned a lot about Father Divine from wanting to write this book on Jim Jones, because I had to go investigating, and I read a book on religion in the USA,
Mm-hmm.
the new religious developments, among which the peace missions by Father Divine was the most impressive.
Mm-hmm. So how was the Guyana government involved in getting them in them being there in the beginning?
They got there because of the Guyana government. You see, it was a time when Mr. Burnham was on the international stage. He was developing closer relations with the Soviet bloc. He was in the non-aligned movement. He was a very active participant in these things, the anti-apartheid movement at a state level, because he commanded everything in Guyana. He could command troops to go on a parade. He could command signatures, When they were signing against the hydrogen bomb, all Mr. Burnham had to do, taking into account the kind of governmental powers he wielded, was to order signatures.
Mm-hmm.
And public servants and everybody so you would get thousands and thousands of signatures, far more than if they were left to people's own choice.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we see the signing of these things, these petitions, became a ritual and very formal, and big, well advertised, and you had to turn up in a parade at a certain time and sign, that kind of thing. So a kind of commandist participation.
So you think, was probably well involved in everything, like where they would be, how they got here, all that sort of stuff.
Oh, I'm coming to that.
Mm-hmm.
You asked the question. They got. You see, Jim Jones went out on a mission seeking a place that he thought was suitable for his purposes. His public reasoning was that he was against atomic warfare,
Mm-hmm.
against the hydrogen bomb and the radiation, and he was looking for a safe place on Earth that would be unlikely to be affected by these developments
I see.
if they took
Interesting.
place.
Okay.
And that attracted him to Guyana. Before going to Guyana, he had gone to Brazil and spent weeks at the expense of his movement in the USA. And he was said to be on sick leave or something like that. He and his wife were there. And it was the only time recorded that Jim Jones was in some kind of contact with the United States Embassy, because his posture was not pro-American at all. His posture was anti-imperialism, and this can be judged. I judge this, and I'm saying his posture because I know posturing. Coming from Guyana, I do know what posturing is on the political stage,
Mm-hmm.
I know that people could proclaim things that would appear to the public to be their motive force, but which were in fact mere conveniences, I saw that at close hand, so that helped me to understand Jim Jones a little more. No. Jim Jones used to claim to be the reincarnation of everybody you can think of. Lenin, anyone, a lot of people of that stature in history. And he was a supporter of every liberation movement on earth you could think of. If you forgot them, Jim Jones would remind you of them. How do I know this? I listened to his tapes. This organization that mounted the film in San Diego that I mentioned runs a website called Alternate Considerations of Jonestown, and they have a massive archive. All of Jim Jones's speeches that they wanted to be there are there. And you could read the text, sometimes you could listen to tapes. It changes, you know, as it goes along. But that is where I learned a lot, and anything I had to say about Jim Jones, and when I write about people generally, critically, I use their own words. I don't put words into their mouth, so I would feel more comfortable quoting them and then making a judgment. Well, that is how I study Jim Jones. Every night, I better leave that a little later and let me answer your first question. He sent a team to Guyana, looking at the terrain, looking at the forest, looking at the government, and this team encountered some people I featured in the book, because what I began to do was to try to find people who had seen the early stages of People's Temple in Guyana. And the earliest stages were this team that he had sent into the Northwest District to look around and find a suitable part of the rainforest where he could settle, you see? And fortunately, we were able to get witnesses. One man was a medical worker in the interior, and he remembers when these men came and they had a chat with him and what they said to him. They were looking for a place where everybody would be equal, and all of Jim Jones's preconditions, you know. And that was in the Northwest District. And this man, a medical worker, gave an interview, which is in the book. He's named in the book. And he repeats what they said to him. So he had this presentation to the world of as a reformer, a revolutionary who wanted a new kind of society. And of course, people warmed to that kind of conversation, you know. My friend who gave this interview was a dreamer. He's one of these people who have dreams. And so he had a lot of suspicions about what Jim Jones was up to. Now, Jim Jones also went to Grenada in the time of Eric Gairy to feel it out to see whether it was a suitable place for him to locate. What happened between them, I do not know, but eventually he chose Guyana. He chose Guyana, and I mention all of that because he and Mr. Burnham were at least on the same rhetorical plane. You get it?
Yeah.
So these are people who probably thought they had something in common. Mr. Burnham also was talking about transforming the economy, and I have to say with respect that he was not the most learned person on national reconstruction, but he had these models in his head, one of them being North Korea, whose culture he tried to adopt in Guyana. He brought mass games to Guyana. And there would be these mass games, dances that would end up with his portrait.
I remember that.
Yes.
Yes.
So I'm talking to a witness, and so they had a lot in common in that sense. It's hard to judge how what a thin line between sincerity and error, you know. But one can only speak of things as they unfold. To be fair, I have my convictions, of course. Now, so I think they thought they were coming together on a common ideological basis because they had the same kind of rhetoric. Interestingly, Jim Jones chose to come into Guyana as a healer, as a faith healer. I don't know whether he discussed that with any of his colleagues in Guyana and was told that that would be a good sell, because at that time Guyana was going crazy about faith healers. There was one who held a fort in Georgetown for several weeks, you know, and appeared on television, and you know, you would just see him touching people and they would drop to the ground and then get up.
Oh my goodness.
Run.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting.
So Jim Jones's first public performance in Guyana was a healing service at Sacred Heart in Main Street. He got the Roman Church to lend him this building. They didn't know who Jim Jones was. I was telling you about the healing service.
Oh, right, that's right.
Yes, because that is something that made me and a lot of my colleagues highly suspicious of this gentleman. Now, there are people who are, you know, genuine healers. They believe they can heal people in these ways. But this man was a crook, because this healing service was later on shown to have people planted who would claim that they had been healed.
Right.
And if you saw the book, the publisher of the book, P.D. Sharma, who's a friend from Guyana and did a very good job on putting that book together, loves publishing. He attended that service himself and was able to write a chapter on it, you see. I had only heard about it in the news and all the fallout that it had, because there was a woman there claiming, who had some part of an animal concealed, claiming to have had cancer, to be healed by Jim Jones, you know, and that kind of thing. So we wrote in one of the publications, I wrote one of the broadsheets. I wrote in at that time, at the time we didn't know, nobody could see what was down the road. And we talked of asking people to beware of these people who come in various guises, some of them performing miracles of healing, and we left it at that. But that was his only attempt at public healing, because it flopped. And the Roman Catholic Church was in a total fury. And, you know, this is what he does. He would get young women of some physical attraction, I believe, and send to people when he wanted something. He sent 2 young women to plead with the Roman Catholic authorities to borrow this church. And they lent him, and then regretted it because of the use he had put to it. Put it to. After that, one hears nothing more about healing, but in People's Temple, he claimed to be a healing. That was his work. He would raise the dead and, you know, that kind of thing. He was Jesus incarnate. He was this body incarnate. and healing was one of his hobbies,
Interesting.
if I may say so.
Mm-hmm.
He was granted a lot of facilities in Guyana. He was granted land, and the book gives the quantity. I don't want to guess it at this stage.
Mm-hmm.
He was given more land than any Guyanese would have got at that period.
Interesting. Did he pay for it?
Hmm?
Did he pay into?
Well, it was what they call state land. You pay a kind of rental. You're not buying it, you see.
Mm-hmm.
He had a kind of long-term lease
I see.
to it. And that was enough. A lease is security.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the exact terms, but I knew a public servant who was working in the Ministry of Lands and who opposed this grant, but was overruled.
Mm-hmm.
He gave me that testimony himself years after when he found out, because all sorts of suspicions arose. They were cutting corners. They were not insisting as they would do with Guyanese on, the rules being kept.
Mm-hmm.
And this chap said, no, I couldn't grant this thing. He was a public servant. He was head of Public Service Union, George Daniels.
Mm-hmm.
And he had to leave Guyana because of repression, because he was opposing the government
Mm-hmm.
at that particular time.
Mm.
And he had been in California. And I talked with him in California. So, what was very interesting about Jonestown was that it was I had to call it, after it imploded, I called it a state within a state. And that was the essence of its undoing.
Mm-hmm.
The people came in without any clearance by the normal immigration. They were expected at government level. They did not have to go through the rigors of the immigration system.
Mm-hmm.
They did not have to be searched. Excuse me. They were highly privileged. People of all races, once you bore the identity of People's Temple,
Mm-hmm.
could come in. In addition to coming through the airport, there were some that came by sea and went directly to the Northwest.
Mm.
They never passed through customs. And this is fully established. They had 2 boats. One of them, I think, was Kojo, and the other one was something, but they are very symbolic names. And he would have his own people navigating them from Florida,
Mm-hmm.
right into the Northwest District. And the first chapter in the book gives a drawing of what the facilities were at Port Kaituma, because it was the same kind of port facilities that the African manganese companies had used.
Mm-hmm.
So this man had done very close research about getting in and getting out through channels that were not monitored.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing about People's Temple in Jonestown was that they had their own broadcasting unit. They could broadcast and be picked up in the United States of America. They had their own tower,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody else in Guyana could get that without a very coveted license. In fact, those licenses were not even given, but Jim Jones had one. And he could stay in Guyana and broadcast to his flock in the USA.
So he still had people in the USA that were part of his church.
Oh yes, not everyone went. They were going in batches. he himself was not among the earliest to come.
Mm-hmm.
He came later, and then his kitchen cabinet followed. And there were always people on the list to come, and he was recruiting all the time, raising funds. And that is how Huey Forston, I think it's Forston. His name I was trying to remember, Huey Forston.
Mm-hmm. I remember. Mm-hmm.
That was one of the best informants I found. So every night they laid out the place, and I was able to get a document that showed that they did carry out agriculture, and a team went in there after the implosion and documented what was found on the ground. I interviewed someone I knew who had been a part of that team, and he gave me a copy of the report, which is published in the book. The actual production going on Julestown,
Mm-hmm.
beds of this and that and the other. They had machinery, so they had a lot of mechanical aids, but he also made people work. In the book also is a report by the Department of Sociology of the University of Guyana, who drew a parallel between Jonestown and the system of enslavement as it existed in Guyana, because the great majority of Jonestown members were African American, and the management was white.
Mm.
Now, saying that is not accurate enough, because I questioned Huey on this point very closely. Rebecca Moore had written something along those lines, that the majority were African, but the management was white. They had something called I think the Planning Commission or something like that. When I asked Forston, he said no. The African Americans were represented on the Planning Commission. They were not excluded. But the Planning Commission was not the decision maker. The decision maker was the kitchen cabinet with Jim Jones and some white women, his favorites,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was where the big decisions were taken. And that was the tragic flaw of that thing, because those people would not criticize Jim Jones.
Mm-hmm.
They would not say no once he expressed a wish. See, he was to them like a great deliverer, more than an icon. Some deliverer, someone that you could trust absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And they looked to him for answers to everything.
Mm.
But this was not an official organ. This was just an institution, an institution that developed of itself through personal contacts and preferences, but yet had all that power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Every night, Jim Jones had a rally in some kind of pavilion at Jonestown, and those speeches are recorded. And it's from those speeches that you understand him, because he speaks very freely. He understood freedom of speech very well, and he exploited it to the full. One of his a very interesting characteristic is he had this aspiration to be a kind of kind of, how shall I put it? A kind of much desired male, a male much desired by women.
Mm.
That was very deep in his psyche. He once boasted that he had to do things to raise money, and that the wife of some congressman or someone in the American government was giving a donation to People's Temple on the condition that Jim Jones became her mate. And he is saying this publicly.
Mm-hmm.
He did not call her name, but people who knew the movements of People's Temple could easily guess it. But he would say things like that to give himself this picture of a most desired male and that kind of thing, most
Virile.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something I watched. Why would he want to do that? Was that one of his main drives or not? Was it incidental? And yet, it is one of the things that led to the destruction of People's Temple.
Mm-hmm.
As you dig into the story, and I read many of the books, especially Raven, it is so silly. A man with those big aspirations, grand designs, could fall for such things. One thing I was about to say when I went off to something else about the link with Burnham, I said that Burnham at the time was having a lot of deepening relations with Eastern Europe
Mm-hmm.
and the non-aligned movement. So was Jim Jones. When the Soviet delegates had to go to California, they stayed at People's Temple
I see.
from New York. So they were probably people in the background giving him a recommendation to Burnham
I see.
and saying, this is a good man, he's one of us,
Mm-hmm.
he is on the left and he's trustworthy,
Mm-hmm.
and there would be no problem because he's on the right side of the international conflict, of the
And-
Cold War.
That must have been an easy way for Burnham to stick it to the U.S. anyway.
Hmm?
That must have been an easy way for Burnham to stick it to the U.S. anyway, right? Say, to proclaim his independence from the United
That's
States.
right, precisely, yes. And he badly wanted to do that after the early links with the CIA.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, what people do not understand, excuse me, is that Mr. Burnham did not deny links with the US government or did not deny that some of the things that went on in Guyana were assisted by state-related elements in the United States of America. This is how he put it. The 1963 conference of the PNC in New Amsterdam, after the 80-day strike, I don't know whether you heard about that. The 80-day strike was a strike of public servants against the Labor Relations Bill, which the PPP was trying to force down the throats of unions. The Labor Relations Bill had been a leading item on the manifesto in 1953. Am I straying?
No, that's okay. That's we keep going. You're fine.
It had been a leading item. I have to say this because
It's background.
I'm making that point.
Mm-hmm.
The Labor Relations Bill was intended to allow the majority union in the sugar plantations to be recognized. because everyone knew that the majority union was not recognized under the MPCA, which had once been a majority union, had become a company union, and was recognized in place of the Guyana Industrial Workers Union led by Lachman Singh,
Mm-hmm.
J.P. Lachman Singh, who also was a cabinet member in 1953. In 1963 now, the PPP in its wisdom brings back a labor relations bill. You follow?
Mm-hmm.
And it again becomes a public issue at a time when the political divisions were severe and anything would do as an objective in the conflict. So there was this 80-day strike against the labor relations bill, and the TUC was of course supported by the PNC and the United Force, and the strike came to an end after they were able to get the government to retreat on this bill. The claim of the unions was that this bill would allow the minister to choose to control the trade union movement
Mm-hmm.
as in the so-called socialist countries. In answering the charge that the CIA had assisted the TUC at that period, Mr. Burnham said at his Congress in New Amsterdam that in a war or in a fight, people take support wherever they can get it.
That's right.
But the point is, who controls the movement?
Yeah.
You know? So
Because once you take the assistance.
he is saying, so what?
Hmm.
He's saying, so what? So
Well, my final question for you is, so what is your assessment of the scope of the Guyanese government's responsibility in the tragedy? Do you think they enabled him to make that final
no,
step?
no.
No.
They got, I mean, I was a principal foe of the Guyana government in those days.
Mm-hmm.
As is well known, I'm on full record. But they would not have wanted that.
They did not. Mm-hmm.
They would not have wanted that.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Jones actually deceived them.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Jones there was an article that appeared in the Chronicle praising People's Temple and praising Jonestown, and Jim Jones admitted that he was the author of it, you know.
Uh-huh.
And it was a big thing to get it published. Jones made some kind of threat to the government at that time, threatened a white knight or something, you know. But what caused that implosion was the fact that Jim Jones was in court. Jim Jones was trying to get possession of a youngster that he claimed to be his son, who was the child of a married couple. Stuen was the name.
Uh-huh.
But this is part of his psyche of, you know, so-called manliness or manhood, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that this was his son, and he wanted to prove it. He wanted possession of the child.
Mm-hmm.
I think he had the child in possession and was fighting the parents, claiming to be the father of the child. And this thing went to court. And he was maneuvering behind the scenes. This was a case in which Justice Bishop refused to do the case
Mm-hmm.
because he was being approached. And I learned from other sources that Chief Justice Bollers had a private meeting with Jim Jones
Mm-hmm.
about the same time in his home. So, So this is very interesting, and it is because Jones felt that the courts were going against him and would arrest him. You follow?
Yes.
That this whole thing happened.
Uh-huh.
He called a white knight, and he told them that the troops would come and destroy the children. His speeches are there.
Yes.
He drove terror into the people and said, look, rather than the troops come, and this was very unfriendly to a government that had befriended him,
Mm-hmm.
because, you know, the government would be crazy to send troops to Jonestown to crush Jonestown after all that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But he said that downright to the people. Drink this thing. It's better to die than to let your children be massacred and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So Rodney made a speech on Jonestown when he came to the United States after the incident in Stanford University, and it's published in the book. And the question he asked was to avoid all this speculation of whether this thing could have been foreseen, and he debated whether it was preventable or not.
Mm-hmm.
And he came to the view that it was preventable. So that would be a very important speech for people to study.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in the book. I published it with their permission. Now, so why did not the army prevent this massacre? This is one of the most important things in the book, because this person that I interviewed, who was in the military, he was a kind of officer, and he explained that the troops, after they got the first reports, were dispatched to Jonestown. But because of the rain, they could not land at Port Kaituma,
I see.
which is not a landing place, you see, not an airport. They had to go to Matthews Ridge and walk from Matthews Ridge to Jonestown. And by the time they got there, everything was over.
Oh my goodness.
And that is one of the things I think the book contributes to history, because I haven't seen it anywhere else.
Yeah, I did not know that.
And I got it in an interview with Mr. What's his name? Lennox Massey, whose name is mentioned. The same person who had given me the record of what they found growing and so on.
Sorry about that.
Although Jim Jones had such a clear non-racial manifesto, the psyche was something different. In fact, as a younger man, he had fought against segregation in his hometown. He had fought and stood up against segregation, but little things like this. There was a man called Imes, an elderly pastor of the church, very wise man. And Jim Jones was adopting black children. He had a son who was African American,
Mm-hmm.
carrying the name Jones. When Imes tried to adopt a white child, Jim Jones opposed it.
Mm.
You see the subtle thing?
Yes, indeed.
And the man became suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
And Huey Forston said that Imes confided in him that Jones had a plot to wipe him out. Because he was elderly, he didn't flatter Jim Jones.
Mm-hmm.
He would tell him flatly, you know, you're doing so and so, it doesn't look good. Excuse me. If you call yourself a prophet, you'll be opening yourself to a lot of, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And Jim Jones didn't want that kind of advice. He wanted to be encouraged.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as his white kitchen cabinet would do.
Mm-hmm.
And tell me, yes, you're right, you should do more than that, and so on. I don't know whether that, any of that is helpful, but that is it. One thing more,
Mm-hmm.
after the implosion took place, the Minister of Information held a press conference. And I represented Day Clean at this press conference. And
That's the newspaper.
Hmm?
Day Clean was the newspaper?
Day Clean was the instrumental, was the broadsheet of the Working People's Alliance.
Okay.
Yes. And so I was there to represent Day Clean, and I asked her whether she wouldn't say Day Clean is a state within a state, because of all that I've mentioned. You know, all the state facilities that they enjoyed that no one else in Guyana could enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
She said, no, it was not a state, it was a farm. And that kind of thing. That, Jim Jones could call the army and arrange for him to be flown to Georgetown by an army plane.
My goodness.
Yeah. I have that on testimony from someone who had been high up in the PNC and had retired and asked that her name be not mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One thing is that Jim Jones, he raised a lot of money, but he was not raising it for his personal use. That's another thing about him, you know.
Uh-huh.
He was not that kind of crook, but he was raising it to be controlled by him. This same lady that I just mentioned, whose name was not to be called, this same lady said Jones showed her a suitcase of American dollars, which was hers, which could be at her disposal at any time.
Huh.
Yeah. And it was just that he was impressed by her and her role in the political movement, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a woman that he wanted an affair with or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But he wanted her to take charge of the children at Jonestown. And she had other things to do.
Mm-hmm.
So although he wasn't stealing money for his own bank account or anything like that, he felt free to dispose of it as he wished, which is another part of the same thing.
Right. This has been an interesting hour. Thank you so much.
Is there anything I haven't answered to your satisfaction?
No, I think you've
Because
answered all of the questions.
I stray wrong.
No, that's perfectly fine. That's.
I like to give background, you know.
I know, and we need it because
Okay.
we don't know it, and you have it all in your head.
Mhm.
So thank you so much, and
Yeah.
thank you from the guys up in England at the Guyana Speaks meeting, and
You're welcome.
we will talk again.